That's a lovely name. Good evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Illinois Green Party series. I'm your host, David Rych. A very special, very cool guest on tonight, Dr. Mary J. Ruwart, who had been on my radio show, Realities Radio, several years ago during the pandemic. She was on at least twice, maybe three times. I think it was twice. And had fabulous conversations. She's also the author of a few books, one called Healing Our World, another one called Death by Regulation, and then you mentioned one before the show, a third one.
Short answers to the tough questions.
A short answer to the tough questions. Is that like a philosophy book?
Oh, actually, it's a book about having sound bites for the libertarian candidates. And I wrote a column for years for the Advocates for Self-Government. And it's a compilation of that column. So short answers.
Very cool. Yeah, you should check it out. I've read Healing Our World. You should definitely check it out. Talking about libertarian compassion. That kind of thing, which is really, really very, what I found amongst libertarians is that they are definitely have that, just give us free association or we're going to be nice people. I mean, it's not really much more than that. So anyway, let's talk. So she is a PhD in biophysics and a bachelor's in chemistry?
Biochemistry for my
biochemistry. Okay, so those are some pretty impressive academic credentials. I have my degrees as well. I never made it to PhD level, but I always had a very, very high regard for PhD because that's the highest you can achieve academically, like literally around the globe. So like it's just amazing. I always enjoy beating PhDs because you just excelled at literally the highest level. You hit the apex of academia. And biophysics is nothing to be trifled with. Biology is nothing to be trifled with, and certainly physics isn't. So the combination of the two has got to be a very powerful force, intellectual force, right? So that being establishing your credentials, this is, Mary's not like some wacko conspiracy theorist. She knows what she's talking about. You are in some pharmaceutical company for 19 years. Is that right? Why don't you go and tell us about your past a bit?
Yes. So I did a postdoc in surgery, which is kind of unusual for a person with my credentials. And then I went to the Upjohn company for 19 years, where I learned a lot about, what really happens there. And this was during the time that the 1962 amendments to the Food and Drug Act were really kicking in. So I saw the damage that they did to the whole industry. They changed the industry from what I'll call an ethical and well-respected profession to something that is very different. Most people today feel it's just out there to make money. And I saw how that transition happened. There used to be scientists in charge of these companies. In fact, most of them were started by scientists. In the case of the Upjohn company, Dr. Upjohn, he was a medical doctor, invented what he called the friable pill. In other words, the pill that actually came apart in your body so you could absorb the things that were in it. Before that, you might take a pill and it might pass right through you. So this was a big advance. But what's happened with the 1962 amendments, it's made it so costly to get FDA approval that the scientists were pushed out of management and the MBAs were put in. So they might not know a whole lot about medicine really, but what they do know about is the bottom line. And that sort of took over the industry because it became impossible for anything but giant companies to survive because the cost of getting an FDA approval was so great. And if the FDA didn't approve, the company would go under. So there were a lot of mergers going on. And that's what's happened today. Basically, there are a handful of giants that actually go to the FDA and get the drugs approved. And then there's lots of little startups that are actually the innovators. And a lot of them, of course, go out of business. And they are almost, I don't want to say forced to license to the big guys, but the big pharma. But it's pretty close because there's only a few of them that have been able to break through and get their own approval because the FDA prefers to deal with known people. So they prefer the big companies, and that shows in how they handle the applications that the smaller companies make.
Interesting. I remember as a child, I have vague memories of like just my parents we were like smack dab in the middle of the middle class, like not high, not low, just right there. So, which was fine. I had a very fine childhood. But I remember, like, they had insurance for the bigger stuff, and like, for like a doctor's appointment, she could just pay out of pocket. I remember watching her write checks, and we were, we didn't like get devastated financially over, and I had certain issues with myself. I had to have surgery. I'm not gonna say why, it was kind of weird, but yeah. And then all of a sudden, like now, like you have to have insurance, and if you don't get it, like through Obamacare or something, you're dropping like $1,200 a month for you and your family. It's crazy because everything has to go through you. All the doctors get paid through insurance, and like David, I remember my GP a couple of years ago complaining that she wasn't allowed to give me a certain something, though she would prefer to do so because the insurance company wouldn't let her. I'm like, that's insane. So now we have like it's like they're letting the what is it, inmates from the asylum. I don't remember that's not the right analogy, but like you said, like the scientists, the experts in any given field, by just common sense, should run those things. Why? Well, because they're the experts. That's why. Because they know what they're doing. So, like, to take scientists out of the scientific industry and have somebody else run it seems to be like one of the most like just ridiculous things I've ever heard. And you're hearing about this in other industries too. Just real quick, I remember hearing like George Lucas, who invented Star Wars, saying like it's no longer an art form. It's all just done by like giant corporations and their funding, and that's it. We have to do what they say because they're the money. But they forced the industry into them being the money. Like they totally just ransacked the whole thing, sabotaged it. And so on that note, do you think the healthcare system at this point, I want to talk more in more detail about this stuff, but like, do you think it can go back?
I'm sorry, say that again.
Do you think the healthcare system at this point can go back to where it was?
It could always go back or be better, but whether it will or not, people are so used to the idea of medical insurance. I remember, it sounds like you do too, a time when there wasn't a need for medical insurance because the costs were low. You could pay for your own. But that time's long gone. So most people don't remember that. And that's the problem, is most people don't remember how Liberty actually worked. And think that the government paying for their health care is the only way that it's going to work. Well, of course, you don't really, you have this illusion that you can get all the health care you need. But in fact, what you can get is if you have a cold and you want to go to the doctor, yes, you could do that. But if you really have an expensive procedure that you need, it's not necessarily true that you will get it. And if you do get it, then you may have to wait for a long time. I mean, my sister was in Michigan working for a doctor's office, an orthopedic office, for many years. And a lot of the patients came from Canada because they were told they couldn't get their hip replacement or their knee replacement for years. That's how it works when government takes over the entire system, which of course it has in Canada and most of Europe. So that's really scary. If you have to wait in pain for years to get your surgery, or die waiting because it takes so long for the process of getting your cancer screening and then seeing your doctor and seeing the surgeon and finally getting scheduled for the surgery, you can kind of see where all the wait time can really truly be a matter of life or death.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk more about that, like what we were talking about before the show. But real quick, it's reminding me of like just other aspects of the healthcare system from med school through insurance companies and everywhere in between that it's just outrageously expensive. Like I remember, like it makes me laugh. It's like so ridiculous. Like my buddies who were in med school, like they dropped like $350,000 to go to med school, or over $300,000. I think it might have been 330. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. That's ridiculous. And then the liability insurance that they have to take out so they don't get the crap shoot out of them all the time for, a possible mistake that they make. I mean, it's just everywhere. It's just gone like just through the roof expensive. It's insanity, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And that's, and also the doctors don't have a solo practice anymore. It's almost impossible to support it. So they have to be part of a group practice. And in many cases, those group practices are being bought out by entities that are really investment companies. So their idea is they want to see a bottom line, which means that the doctors can't spend a lot of time with each patient because they have to see a lot of patients and they can't prescribe certain procedures because that would cost more money. So, things are being trimmed back because of the way the system, just like in the pharmaceutical industry, we just talked about it having to kind of consolidate. That's what's happening in the medical profession too. Plus, there's something called standard of care. So I've been consultant for physicians that have been brought before their medical boards for not adhering to what they call standard of care. I mean, it used to be that a medical doctor looked at individual patients and decided what was best for that patient. But now what's happening, the medical boards, which of course control the licensing of physicians, and they can take that license away. What's happening now is if the doctor doesn't go for the practices that the medical board believes are standard of care, and they try to innovate, even if it helps the patient, even if the patient's better off, they come after the physician because they aren't adhering to the standard of care. So this is pretty scary because we rely on the doctors to really take our individual concerns and our individual health and our genetics, environment, etc., into account when they prescribe for us or suggest a surgery. So now that is not happening so much anymore. Most people are not aware that our medical practice is being mechanized basically for one size fits all, and that's always very dangerous.
That's extremely dangerous, and I'm glad you said that because, you know, we treat like if I get a little philosophical and a little logician on it, like, you know, inductive systems are systems that are more organic and can change as it goes. Okay, a deductive system is a formalized system that doesn't change unless you add formal things to it, like definitions and so on like that. So to like sort of ossify these standards as like these absolutes that supposedly apply to all people at all times is just a ridiculous attempt. That can't possibly be the case. Like you were saying, like if a doctor does something outside the standards of care that actually helps the patient, they could still get in trouble. Like it reminds me, like, right? Yes. That's. I mean, I know any rational moral person would be like, well, that's stupid. But like, you know, think about like, you know, this is very libertarian too. Like the police and how like, you know, local governments or the police will arrest you for helping somebody, for helping a homeless person. Like I just gave a homeless person a cheeseburger so they could eat. Well, that's illegal. You're going to jail. Like, excuse me? Like, that's ridiculous. That like now, like I have this phrase, I even have bumper stickers, that morality always trumps the law. Always. Right? And I'm passing them out, and I love this phrase. But most everybody that has ever said that to says, well, of course. Well, that's not the society we live in. You know, now in our society, the law trumps morality, and that's not okay.
That's right. And that's what we saw during COVID. You know, basically, the Constitution was violated in so many ways. And the government went along with it and really convinced most of the populace that this was okay somehow. And that was very scary. I actually would not have predicted that we're so far gone that would have happened. But in fact, it did. And now what we're seeing is a bunch of lawsuits coming up against the government for basically violating the First Amendment, because they actually, there's been a lot of release from, you know, the FOIA documents that the government actually pushed the social media companies into censoring things. So this is a violation. It's I mean, you know, if the company, it's a private company, if it did it itself, okay, maybe you could rationalize that. But when the government is pushing the companies to violate our free speech, that's a whole different cup of tea. That's against
100%. Yeah, I mean, I would still say it's not preferable for like, you know, Zuckerberg to start censoring everybody, but it's his baby, you know. But I mean, yeah, for the government to do that, that's absolutely acceptable, and they're still doing it to this day, and they're still going after Elon Musk and Facebook and everything. You know, they want to develop. Doesn't Biden want to like develop like a ministry of truth? Did I hear that right? We got to be kidding me. The Ministry of Truth. Are you having a hard time hearing me?
Oh yeah, they're trying to have a Ministry of Truth. Yeah, they're still at it, and you know, it would be one thing if it truly was truth. I mean, I wouldn't still support it, but at least one could understand it. But no, it's actually the opposite of truth. It's lies. Basically, what the government did was it actually asked the companies to censor people who were actually telling the truth or were making very good points. And it turns out that everything that they censored was actually true. So it wasn't about truth. It was simply about what is politically expedient. And of course, for this go around with COVID, it looks like what was politically expedient was what would get people to accept a violation of their rights. It wasn't what was going to heal them. I have some authority to say that because of my scientific background. They did not do things. First, they did not do things properly. And one of the things that happens when you heavily regulate an industry, as the FDA has done to the pharmaceutical firms, is the only way the industry can survive is by regulatory capture. In other words, they have a system now where they have captured the FDA. And the legislation for this was passed in 1992 called the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. It started out as an optional $100,000 payment that companies could make to the FDA so they could hire more examiners, so that the process of this 14 years from lab bench to market got cut by 1 year, because the FDA was taking about 2 years to review the 12 years of data that they required of the companies, right? So that was that, but that was at least the timeline was shortened. That was, quote, the good part. The bad part is that was just a step to mandatory user fees that are now very close to $3 million, and now about 70% of the FDA section that approves drugs, their salaries are paid for by these user fees. So they, their salary depends on the pharmaceutical companies paying this user fee. And so when Vioxx was going to be brought to market, and Dr. Graham, David Graham, said, "Hey, we cannot approve this thing. It's dangerous. It causes heart attacks." His boss told him, "Hey, the pharmaceutical industry is our client. We're approving this. Not the American Congress. No." So this is bad. This is really, of course, they had to withdraw because David Graham wouldn't shut up, and he kept pointing out the problem, and they eventually, actually, Merck withdrew it voluntarily because they knew it was going to, if they didn't, it would have made them much more liable than they actually ended up being.
Well, it's still crazy that it was going in that direction. All right, so I want to, before we get full blown into COVID, because I know that's probably going to take a good length of time to talk about, because I remember some shenanigans as well, interviewing people like yourself and other people during the pandemic, and just doing research. Let's talk about supplements, because I know that you're like really big into that, right? Okay, yes. Go ahead, because I read Linus Pauling. I read The Power of Vitamin C. I take 2,000 milligrams a day. I could probably treat my body a little bit better. I mean, I'll forego the details, but yeah, I enjoy having fun. But all the reading I do suggests that there's all sorts of evidence that supplements are actually effective. Now, I also hear, I think the issue with me when it comes to like asking, like if I line up 10 MDs and ask them about supplements, I might get like 7 to 8 different answers. And so it gets frustrating when that's a made up number. I'm just saying, I've heard so many different backs and forth, but so tell us what you think about it. Why supplements are good.
Okay, so when I was in the industry, we didn't have genetic manipulation. That was, back in the olden days. Anyhow, so what we did is to create diseases that human beings often have, like, heart disease, alcoholic liver disease, things like this. What we did is to mimic those diseases, we took certain supplements away. For example, I was working in liver cirrhosis and alcoholic liver disease. And if you take enough choline out of the diets, choline is a B vitamin, just to let you know. Mm-hmm. So, because I don't know that all your listeners would know that. And I don't want to, I want everyone to understand what I'm going to say here. Mm-hmm. So if we took the choline out of their diet, our rats would develop a syndrome very, very similar that looked histologically, like under the microscope, looked like alcoholic liver disease or other forms of liver problems that were so damaging you'd eventually die from. So I argued for a long time in the literature that the problem with alcohol, for example, was not that it was toxic per se to the liver, but it ate up all the choline, and its metabolism, or when the body broke it down, it required that choline to break it down. So if you drank a lot, you got depleted of choline, and then you got sick. Well, of course, this was not the accepted dogma at the time, so I took a lot of heat for that. But eventually, even the people who had been fighting me had to admit that that was in fact the case. So, bottom line here is that the stresses of our life mean that we need more supplementation of different vitamins, all kinds of different vitamins, than you would normally get for the minimal daily requirement, the recommended minimal daily requirement that is the basis of the FDA's decision-making.
The RDA, right.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So bottom line is that that's not optimal. So if you want optimal health, you have to take more than that. And the FDA has been fighting that for a long time. In fact, in the 80s, it was raiding health food stores, went into my doctor's office. So at gunpoint, took all the records, made the doctor pay for them to be copied because now they were all at the FDA and he didn't have access to his patients' records. And of course, the Life Extension Foundation founders, who were libertarians, by the way, they brought coenzyme Q into coenzyme Q10, you might know it as, to the country because it was a prescription item in Japan. The FDA said they were bringing in unbranded, unapproved drugs, and that they would put them in prison for their life. That's what they told them. And their attorney said, you better cut a deal because you can't win against the FDA. Well, guess what they did? And the reason they did is they just refused to, as the FDA kept lowering the number of counts, they said, no, we're not going to settle. And they went on the radio, shows like yours, and talked about how important coenzyme Q was and how it was something your body made, and why are we having to call it a drug and go through these 14 years to get it. And if they had not stood their ground, if the Life Extension founders had not stood their ground, we wouldn't have coenzyme Q10 today. And that is so important because a lot of people, when they take statins, it's almost become standard of care for the doctors to prescribe coenzyme Q because statins deplete coenzyme Q and results in muscle pain and muscle weakness and things like that. And the way to prevent it is to supplement with coenzyme Q. So this is the kind of thing that is really important about supplements. They help your body do the best it can, even when it's under kind of threat, if you want to call it that, by getting a substance that the body doesn't normally see. The body has a way to fix that, to break it up and make it safe for you. But it needs these supplements, it needs these extra things that it normally makes, but needs to make it in bigger quantities than it can. So that's where these supplements really are major. And of course, everybody's different. We don't have good ways to test for what works for us, unfortunately, not yet. But you can kind of tell on some supplements, for example, I can tell that I don't feel as good if I don't take them. And so everyone's kind of got to experiment on themselves. I hate to say that, but that's really the state of the art right now. It's not easy to know exactly how much you need.
That's very interesting. And I remember reading, well, I worked at a health food store. It was 1999 because I remember the owner was all scared of the Y2K thing. I remember I would just sit there like in between customers coming in and I would just read as much as I could in literature. Some of it was just kind of new age nonsense. But a lot of it was really like solid stuff. I remember reading that that CoQ10 was prescribed in Japan by doctors. And I remember thinking, I'm like, well, why isn't that the case here? Like, I don't like what do bodies work differently in Japan than they do in America? Like, generally speaking, no. I mean, that's how individual to individual, sure. And I just read like it's all sorts of literature like what a powerful antioxidant it is. It just really kind of kicks the free radicals out of that little mitochondria cell, and allows it to get back into shape, which encourages energy production. I'm not taking it currently, but I think I'm going to go buy some tomorrow. I do take a lot of supplements, but that's not one of them. I asked a pharmacist not too long ago about it. He said, well, there's no real science-based evidence that it does anything. I'm like, okay. That's kind of like their go-to answer. What that really means is I haven't looked into it. I have no idea what I'm saying. That's what that means. It's unfortunate. right?
Yeah, it is. It is. Well, now remember during COVID, the people who survived the best were the ones that had high vitamin D levels. All we had to do during COVID is supplement with vitamin D, and most people would have really benefited from that.
I remember hearing and reading about that as well. So let's use that as our segue into like all the shenanigans of COVID-19. And I'm assuming you know much more about the shenanigans than I do. But let me kick it off with this. I remember this, and this is verifiable. You can find it. I remember talking to doctors back then. I've recently seen an interview with a former doctor that said the same thing, that the CHC was encouraging doctors that on a death certificate, even though there was a little box for like, other conditions going on at the time, which you could have included like, tested positive for COVID, but the main cause of death was something else, to switch that around and go ahead and put the main cause of death as COVID, even when in fact it wasn't, because they were getting money for each time, like $13,000 was the common number I heard. Every time they had a death certificate that says COVID, they got money. So of course, which is just complete and total, if you don't mind me saying, bullshit. That is just an awful, terrible thing. You got to be kidding me. So the numbers just by that alone are completely skewed. Like we don't know. I even know. Like we have to go case to case to find out which ones were actually not the main cause of death being COVID, to find out how much less people actually had COVID and died from something else. But go ahead.
Yes. Well, and I don't know that we'll ever know, because I don't know if it's sorted out. But of course, they were also paid something like $30,000 to put people on ventilators, which was contraindicated in COVID. It actually killed people. So this was another bad thing. And then the government really wouldn't allow early treatment, which, if you think about it, if you go into your doctor and you've got all these symptoms, the doctor tries to at least treat your symptoms, right? But doctors were instructed to, if somebody came in and they were complaining, I'm having a hard time breathing, I've got this flu-like symptoms and all, they said if they test positive for COVID, and by the way, the PCR test is not very accurate. So there were a lot
There's that. Right.
And we can talk about that if you
yes.
get in the weeds on that. But so basically, we were told, the doctors were told, to send people home and tell them, well, when you really can't breathe at all, kind of come back in. Well, that's ridiculous.
That's pretty stupid.
Untreated symptoms. I mean, there are over-the-counter sprays, nasal sprays, and things that you can use. Budesonide is the one that I'm most familiar with, to really help open the airways so that you can breathe. It's kind of a nice thing to do. You need to do it. And
I enjoy it.
And also it really seemed to have a positive effect in helping your body clear the virus. So this was all good. I mean, there was ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, and what these drugs kind of do is open your cell up to zinc. So if you take zinc with them, which is very important, to take zinc with them, then the zinc would go in the cell and it would kill the virus. So, but you needed to get to it early. So, for example, what I did is I had a stock of these kinds of things in my home, because I realized that if I got sick, it would take me several days to get a hold of these things. So, and if a couple times I felt like maybe I was coming down with something, and I figured, even if this is the flu, this stuff's going to work. So I took that. And I, knock on wood, I was very fortunate I did not contract COVID. And as I said, the PCR test is really faulty. In fact, the person who invented the PCR test said it should never be used the way it was being used. So that's, should never be used for diagnosis. I mean, this whole thing was medically screwed up. So it's really amazing we came through it at all. And but basically what was maybe at the best a bad flu season was made out to be so horrendous that we shut down our economy. We basically put the mom and pop shops out of business in favor of the Amazon and Walmarts and things of that nature. And I doubt that we'll recover from that. We kept our kids out of school. It's now pretty clear that they've lost quite a bit of traction in terms of learning. And then because people were locked down, there was an increase in suicides, abusive family relationships, when people were frustrated. They couldn't go to work in many cases. Their jobs were shut down. So, that financial tension and things like that are all drivers for things like suicide, alcoholism, drug abuse, and of course, spousal or child abuse. So this is really bad. I mean, there were a lot of bad things that happened, and people died from these things. In fact, there are many scientific papers coming out now showing that lockdowns did so much more harm than good. In fact, what's coming out is they really didn't do any good at all. So lockdowns didn't help, masks didn't help. And this is all in the published literature, the medical literature. It's not being hidden as much anymore. But all the early treatment things are it's still really, really hard to get published with those early treatments because, in fact, the medical journals are retracting some of the articles that were so positive in the beginning.
Oh, really?
That's partly because their income is primarily from pharmaceutical advertising. So, of course, the pharmaceutical companies want to sell their more expensive new products rather than, having people treat themselves with these, well, actually, Nobel Prize winning drugs like ivermectin. It won the Nobel Prize in medicine because it was such a great drug. Low side effects, a lot of efficacy, especially in low-income countries where they had malaria and things of this nature. And this thing took out the parasites and a lot of other things. So it's a great thing. And it was really not only banned in some places, but it was ridiculed as a horse dewormer. Of course, it is a horse dewormer, but it won the Nobel Prize in medicine for human treatment. And you never hear that, of course, on the news.
No, I didn't know that either. That it was. No, I read and heard that it was effective. And obviously, I remember it being ridiculed. But I never heard that it won the high level, the Nobel Prize. Huh?
I'm sure it would have been taken down off social media if somebody put it up there.
Right, because the Ministry of Truth decided that it wasn't true. But and that points out another thing about like medicine, healthcare, and politics, and the dangerous connection between those two things. It's probably just as dangerous as like the church and state being aligned. That's one of the more clever parts of the Constitution was to separate those two entities, because you get political bias interpreting the data. Ivermectin, I know has plenty of efficacy and success, but you know why people ridiculed it? Because Donald Trump said it. Because he advocated for it, and nobody's going to believe Donald Trump because he's an idiot. No, that's what they think. Like he said something about it in a press conference once. It was like, "Oh, it's a horse-born pill drug. You're a moron." It can't possibly be true if Donald Trump said it. Now, I'm no fan of Donald Trump. Don't get me wrong, but I mean, just because it's also to attach the proposition to the person is what's in logic is called an ad hominem. That's a fallacy in reasoning. The person who says it has nothing to do with whether or not what they said is true or false. They have nothing to do with each other. So that's politics galore, by the way, is ad hominems. That's all it is. Would you agree with that, or do you want to add to it, or?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. That was, in fact, I think what he mostly talked about in the beginning was hydroxychloroquine. And that one acts kind of similar to ivermectin.
Maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Okay.
Yeah, but there actually is a book coming out this month, I think in a few days actually, called The War on Ivermectin by Peter Corey, who's actually gone through. He's one of the docs that was courageous enough to use ivermectin, and he encountered a lot of this prejudice, like in the medical journals and things like that. So I've heard him talk about it, so I think it's going to be a very interesting read. So if any of your listeners are really excited about learning more about exactly how this thing was manipulated in terms of ivermectin, that's a book to maybe think about getting. And it's pre-sold now on Amazon, and really, I think you can also buy it on the highwire.com.
You can buy it over the counter?
Yes, you can see. The highwire.com is a program with Del Bigtree, who was an Emmy Award-winning producer of The Doctors, and he's been talking about all of these COVID crazies that have been going on, I guess you could say. But he has a nonprofit, ICanDecide.org, and that nonprofit is publishing Peter Corey's book. So, and if anyone wants to kind of go back in time and see what he was saying about COVID, it's a very interesting show. It's one I thought was one of the absolute better ones on COVID. And of course, he got shut down. You know, they took his social media away, his YouTube away, everything. But he managed, because of his stature, he was able to continue and get donors, you know, private donations to go ahead and produce the show. And has actually, the nonprofit arm has sued the government multiple times. I think it may be up to about 15 times now and won. In fact, if you recall, Pfizer wanted to keep the data that they had submitted to the FDA private for 75 years. 75 years. And when ICANN sued, the FDA said, well, no, we can't produce documents that fast. Well, presumably they reviewed all these documents, so why can't they produce them? And the judge, of course, realized they were, that this was ridiculous, and they demanded that they produce them in a year. Well, the year's gone by, and they produced something like 450,000 pages. Now we find out there's another 1,000 pages that they didn't tell us about, and ICANN's gone back to make sure that we get those too. And if you go to thehighwire.com, you can also look for those Pfizer documents and read them for yourself. I think if you're not used to reading such documents, it might be a little confusing, but
sure.
I'm used to reading such documents, so I'm there, and I know quite a bit about that, because one of the things I do now is I sit on an IRB, which is an institutional review board. We're a for-profit group. What we do is review the human studies that companies and individuals want to do before they're allowed to actually execute them. And we make sure that the people that are going to be in the study get this 20-page informed consent that tells them things like you can leave anytime, you cannot be coerced into this, like the government was doing by threatening to take your job away. And of course, the other things it tells you is that it tells you like what the potential side effects are as best they are known, and what the potential benefits to you are. And of course, the people in the Pfizer study probably received an informed consent. I haven't seen it yet. That was one of the documents that didn't come out. At least to the best of my knowledge, it's not been out. And that would be a very important document to see. But of course, people who got the shot under the EUA, the emergency use authorization, they were supposed to get an informed consent. They did not. They got some verbal stuff from their doctor, but the doctors really had to say, hey, this is great, you better take it. Or if they didn't, their medical board probably would have come after them. And in fact, some doctors have lost their license over not pushing the shot. So this has been really bad, not just for the patients, but for the doctors as well. The doctors who are still ethical, a lot of them can no longer practice.
Wow. That's insane.
Yeah.
I took the vaccinations because I just remember being very confused. Like, I just remember hearing so much stuff on this side, and because I do more research than the average person does on things, and I'm hearing what Fauci's saying, I'm hearing what the doctors are saying, I'm hearing what the pharmacists are saying, I'm listening to what you're saying too, and I'm like, I don't know. Personally, I'm not qualified to parse through all this information and to see who's I agreed with a lot of what you said, but somebody would say something well, that makes sense too. So I'm not a doctor. I mean, I have training in the sciences, but not in that realm of science. It has more to do with the metaphysics of science, which science counts as. But so I got the vaccines, and I just never really was generally opposed to vaccination. I mean, it got rid of polio and the measles and stuff like that. So, and I just hope one day I don't end up hearing some sort of catchphrase from the table next to me, and then turns me into some sort of CIA zombie because they put a microchip in me. Did you, I mean, would you have then recommended not getting vaccinated or just don't feel like you have to? But which one of those would it have been?
Well, first of all, you have to realize it's not a standard vaccine. So in a standard vaccine, you get a measured dose of antigen. Antigen is the substance that you want your body to make antibodies against, right? This is
Right.
what you want your body to know when it sees it next time, it's going to kill it, right? But that's not what's in this vaccine. What's in this vaccine are the mRNA instructions for your body to make the antigen. Now, given that everybody's body is different, everybody is going to make a different amount of the antigen. You are not getting a standard dose like you would with a normal vaccine. And that is bad. And the reason it's bad is because, okay, we're all different weights and stuff. So when we get the standard amount of antigen, there's going to be some side effects because some people are overdosed and some people are getting too little. But when you're giving the instructions, we don't know how your body's going to handle that. And that means that there's going to be even more doses. I mean, you don't have to be a scientist to get this, right? I mean, if you're getting the instructions instead of the antigen,
right,
you don't know how much your body's going to produce. And so some people have taken this and they've died from it. Some people have been crippled for life, and what's interesting is it would be one thing if the doctors and the government said, oh, this is horrible. And, we didn't want this to happen to anyone. And, obviously we need to make sure you're taken care of. But that isn't what happens. What happens is these people are told, hey, can't be a vaccine side effect. Vaccines don't have side effects. And that's just ridiculous because in the early 1980s, the vaccine companies were down to 2. And the reason they were down to 2 is because vaccines are a biological product. And on the average, a biological product is going to have more side effects than a regular drug. I mean, obviously there are exceptions. That's why I said on average. Okay. So, and of course, the companies can only basically give 1 dose or maybe a dose and a booster, for each vaccine. And that's really all they can do. That's all they can sell. So they can't recover the cost of the FDA, the very now high cost of the FDA approval. So basically, the 2 companies left standing said, we're going to quit making vaccines because, we're losing money on these things. And so the government said, wait, no, don't do that. We need the vaccines, especially for our military. So what we want you to do is recognize that we, the government, are going to take all the liability. You won't have to get sued anymore. We will now cover the people that are harmed. And they don't really do a very good job of covering the people that are harmed. In fact, there are whole types of vaccines they won't even hear cases on. So the victims are really not compensated. But in addition, since there's no liability, there's no marketplace check on the vaccine makers. So it used to be like when I was young, I think I had 2 vaccines, maybe 3 at the most, polio, TB,
measles.
Now they're okay. So now before the child is 18, there are about 79 vaccines. That includes the boosters. 79. I wouldn't take that many vaccines as an adult.
Right. Yeah, that's crazy.
Yeah, and so now we're seeing rising problems with our children, autism and other things. And of course, you would expect to see more problems with our children because 79 doses to a child with an immature immune system, you're going to have problems. You're going to have problems. I mean, as a biologist, I can just tell you that's, we wouldn't give kids, we wouldn't give them a lot of different drugs that adults get without some testing. I mean, that you're supposed to test them before you give them to kids. But we really didn't have much in the way of testing on the COVID vaccine before we authorized them for children. And of course, now we're seeing a lot of myocarditis, especially in our young men. The VA is seeing a lot of service people with problems. And, it makes kind of an odd sort of sense because remember, we just talked about how you're getting the instructions to make the antigen. Well, if you think about it, wouldn't you expect young, healthy people to make more antigen? I mean, I'm not sure that's happening, but the data seems to go in that direction, because also at the other end, Britain is reporting data that if you're 80 years old or older, the vaccine really has no effect. It gives you no protection at all. And okay, so an elderly body would probably have trouble making the antigen. Maybe it doesn't make enough to get an immune response. I mean, again, this is all speculation on my part, just looking at what the data that I've seen. It's my working hypothesis, as they call it in the industry. But I think we have to consider that there's something very wrong with giving the instructions, because everybody is going to react much differently. It's true that when we all get the same amount of antigen, yes, we're going to react differently, but this is multiplied when you just get the instructions. I mean, you wouldn't go to your doctor, and if your doctor said, okay, you need this drug, and if you ask him, well, how much do you think I need? And he shows you this bottle with these colored pills, all different colors. He says, well, all the different dose sizes are in this jar, and I really don't know what you need, so just stick your hand in and take it. When we see that doctor, we rush out of that office so fast. But that's essentially what we did with the COVID vaccine. I mean, that's the analogy I think is very easy for anybody, any layperson to understand. That's what we did with the COVID vaccine.
Okay, so then basically back then you would have said don't get the vaccine. You would have recommended not get it. You did do that? I did say no. Yeah, okay.
Well, I also knew there were only 2 months of safety data. Remember, I
remember it was rushed through. I remember that was part of the controversy at the beginning, is that, and why the vaccine didn't come out until like a little bit later after we discovered that COVID was a thing, was that they didn't have enough testing, and that they just sort of like sped it up a bit and said, okay, this is good enough, according to them, let's go ahead and send it to market. I remember that.
Well, if you look at the documents that Pfizer submitted to the FDA, it said very clearly, we did not test to see if this prevented transmission, which of course is exactly what you want a vaccine to do, right?
Yes.
And it doesn't. It turns out it didn't prevent transmission, which again, we kind of knew this would happen. And the reason I say that is we've never been successful making a coronavirus vaccine in the past. And part of the reason is the thing mutates. But another thing, when we did animal studies, the animals died. They didn't die from the vaccine. They died when they were exposed to the very disease that they were supposed to be protected against. And there's a reason for this. It's kind of a so what happens is your body overreacts, and it has more antibody pouring out, so much that it actually attacks your body, and you create so much damage. You have what's called a cytokine storm. You might have heard that term, and many of your listeners might have heard that term. It's kind of the same thing that happens like if you have a really good working cancer drug, and you take so much of it that the cancer dies immediately. And of course, the cells release all their toxins, and you get really sick from that. So, obviously, you have to have a balance here. This stuff biology is pretty complex, and we are in our infancy in understanding it. So this is, and I say that as somebody who works in the field, right? So,
yeah.
We don't know as much as we think we know, and a lot of times our physicians aren't aware, because they get their medical knowledge from the scientists who are working in the field. And usually there's, I'd say, 10 to 30-year gap between the lab bench and medical practice. And that's probably going to get bigger, because we aren't, we've made it so hard to get knowledge out, even before COVID, with this 14-year lab bench to marketplace on drugs. Used to be 4 years, now it's 14 years about. So it can come down a little bit, but not much. So it's really difficult to figure out exactly what's going on. And a lot of the biology that used to be done in the pharmaceutical firms are not done to the extent that it was in my day. When I was with a pharmaceutical company, every company almost did really significant research. And that's not happening anymore with the big pharma. They're basically just a development machine because, again, the FDA knows them and likes them and doesn't like to deal with new little companies because there's so many of them. They don't know how to handle that. So I'm not saying that it never happens, but, for the most part, it's not.
Sure. So for the 4 years to 14 years thing, so talk about how you can, from that, you can somehow determine the amount of people that have died because of the weight.
Right. Well, the pharmaceutical industry has been very well studied, probably more than just about anything. And there've been estimates of how many lives, I should say life years, have been saved from the drugs that have come out between 1980 and 1991, or maybe I'm not sure that the 1980s, right? It might be late 70s to 91, I think is the number. Anyhow, so those drugs, more so than the later drugs, probably were truly life-saving, at least to some extent. So using that number and knowing how many years in each decade since the amendments were passed, how many extra years were tagged on to drug development in that decade. And so you can make that calculation. It's 15 million Americans that have died since the 1962 amendments till about 2010. And that's more deaths, at least at that point in time it was, more deaths than all the wars put together, including the American Revolution. In the U.S., the thing is, what happens in the U.S. ripples outward into the world. So if there's a delay in getting a drug to market in the U.S., and the U.S. was the major producer of new drugs for a long time, that means those delays are also happening in other countries. And so, the whole world is suffering, basically, if these drugs are indeed life-saving. Now, from 2010 on, I'm not so sure that the number would be as high as it was. In fact, I was shocked that the number was as high as was reported. So I went back and I looked at where that number came from by doing an entirely different way of calculating it. And of course, it was mostly due to cardiovascular disease going down. And I looked at those numbers, and yes, in fact, it looks very clear that the drugs that came out in that time period probably did save as many lives as were purported to by the study I used. And not too many people have tried to calculate it because it's kind of tough to do. So, we have to take this with a grain of salt. But the big loss was of innovation, because now companies couldn't put their money into research. They had to put it into getting the FDA approval. And, it's the cost of getting FDA approval is not stagnant. It's going up exponentially every year. Exponentially, which means, it's not just like linear, it's going way up. And so this is unsustainable. At some point, it's going to implode, because only 2 to 3 out of every 10 drugs even make back the amount of money they've paid for the FDA approval. So it's really, the whole system is unsustainable. And I've had people argue with me, well, the companies are making so much profit. Well, yeah, maybe right now they are. but it's the blockbuster drug. So what is happening? Companies won't develop drugs that only have to be given, once or twice. They want a drug that you'll take for the rest of your life. What's dangerous about this for consumers is that your body can handle an acute insult. So if you have to take a drug once or twice, usually your body can adapt. But if you have to take a drug for decades, that's when your supplements get depleted, when your nutrients get depleted. Right. If you don't have the right supplement mix, and who does these days, because you can't really easily determine it, you're going to be hurting.
Yeah. And there's a whole other topic there about antibiotics and the long-term effects of too much of those things too. It's eventually the genes mutate to the point where none of them will work, and then we're screwed. Something like that. Do I have that basically right?
Say that again. I missed that part. The last
Just about taking too many antibiotics for
Oh,
like
yes.
every little thing, and like eventually you're going to develop like these super bugs that like just no antibiotic is going to work, and like everybody's going to die.
Yeah. Well, that's a problem, but it's not the same problem as taking something for decades. Taking something for decades is, antibiotics. I should back up. Antibiotics. What happens? The bacteria in your body develop resistance.
Right.
Because there's a few of them that'll survive and they'll be there when things go wrong. And what makes things go wrong sometimes are taking a drug for decades, because now your body gets depleted of the nutrients that it needs to detoxify them. What your body does is when it gets a new drug that it hasn't seen before, it breaks it down so it's not toxic to you anymore. And it goes through your liver or your kidneys generally. And, that process absorbs some nutrients, right? And if you don't resupplement those nutrients, or if you aren't able to eat enough of something to counter that, then you will start getting a disease. Like if you deplete your vitamin C, you might have a scurvy-like problem.
Yeah.
I just use that example because most people are familiar with it, but it can be, there can be consequences for other types of nutrients as well.
Interesting. Okay, we only have a few minutes left. This is crazy. Like I have so many more things I want to talk about. So let's fit in masks real quick, because that's one thing I remember doing a lot of research on during the pandemic. And I was, I'm a team player, so I wore my masks out in public and didn't complain about it. Knowing just because if it made you feel safer around me, then just okay, fine. And I had fun. I love Prince, the musician, so I had my Prince mask and everything else. So like I had some fun with it, but I also knew it was complete nonsense. And I think I remember sending you the video of the philosopher and the doctor debating about the efficacy of masks. This is several years ago, and I am a philosopher of science, and like it embarrassed me because the philosopher was so ridiculously wrong, and he was like getting agitated and like, well, that's like he lost his demeanor and his composure, and the scientist like had all these like just like basic facts and did like all these like random I just forgot the name. What's it called? What kind of random something trial? Random control trial. Yeah, which is like the gold standard in science, because that's how you can get a lot closer to a cause than just mere correlation. I remember the philosopher, all his charts were merely correlational, which is good to a certain extent, but if you can get a causation over a correlation, always take the causation, of course. So that's just a no-brainer. And he said, the doctor was saying, like, well, look, we've done like 14 of these studies, and they all show that there is no evidence to show that masks stop the spread of these things. It's 14 of them. And the philosopher's like, oh, you can't do those kind of things because it's unethical. He's like, what are you talking about? We already did 14 of them. Do you have at least a basic memory of that? And
Yeah. I'll be really simple and do the layperson's explanation. Think about the mask on your face.
Right.
You know that big gap over here where it hits your face? The viruses are going to get in there. You got to breathe the air, right? So that's what's going to happen.
That was one of the scientists' point. Is like, look, first of all, I remember also, like, I had the Lake County coroner who was trained in like some like an NPA or something like that. But she knows this stuff enough. And I had her on my radio show, and I'm like, wait, let's talk about masks, because you deal with people dying of these things all the time. I'm like, give me a break. The virus is 2 microns big, which I don't think anybody can actually visualize. It's just super, 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 super small. Okay. And like, I want you to think like when the government was saying, well, just wear anything, like a bandana, the pores in a bandana is not going to stop a 2 micron large anything. It can't, it's not even like physically possible. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
The only thing, if you did have COVID, of course, you probably wouldn't go out and get involved with people. But if you sneezed,
right,
the mask would, it would
collect some of it.
It would have something, yes. So it would have probably some benefit. But if you're healthy, it's no benefit. In fact, it's just the opposite, because
Right.
you're breathing a lot of carbon dioxide,
Right.
and you're not getting enough oxygen. And actually, I think I did see one study where it suggested that people. I mean, I've seen actually more than one study that suggested that you were actually more likely to be sick if you wore a mask. And that's partly because you've got all these germs and everything you're recirculating,
Okay.
and you're lowering your oxygen level, at least, carbon dioxide's going up for sure. You can actually put a measuring stick in there and see the carbon dioxide.
Yeah, no, for sure.
So, it doesn't make any sense. And actually, I think on the High Wire, I did see Adele Bigtree interviewing some people from the EPA who talked about this whole thing, the mask. I mean, they're the experts, right? They know what these masks do. And they were saying, nah, this isn't going to help you.
Well, the WHO said, well before the pandemic, that masks, they said the same thing we're saying now. Fauci even said something similar and then changed his mind. And I don't know, do you think Fauci said all that he said and did all that he did just from political pressure? Or do you think that he really believed what he was saying? Or do you think he was lying and got away with it? You don't know?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can't read their minds, but I think there probably were people in all these organizations, some of whom really believed what they were saying, and then some who were, it was more about, from what I can see with everything else, I think it was more about getting people to comply and, getting them used to accepting the dictates of government or government-like bodies. And what's happening now, my understanding at the World Economic Forum, for example, is they're trying to rewrite their charter in such a way that their dictates will be mandatory. So, they decide what is a pandemic. And they also decide what a country can or cannot do about that pandemic.
Wow. The new global order.
World government, and I have to say, one of the things, what we all read in 1984 in our schools, and a lot of us were saying, well, okay, this is horrific, but how did we get there? How could we possibly get there from here? Well, I think that's what we saw during COVID.
Right.
We found that people are, a lot of time, because if you can create enough fear, people will want an authority figure to tell them what to do, and they will do it. And it's kind of like, when you think about what happened in Germany during World War II. Why did that happen? I mean, these were, for the most part, really civilized, normal people who, had families and, were actually had interacted with the Jews, for example, and other groups that were targeted. And all of a sudden, they were willing to watch bad things happen to them. And part of it was probably fear that if they didn't cooperate, those bad things would happen to them as well. And while we can understand that, if we go down that road, then we'll all be in trouble, because, they start with just like in the U.S., they start with drug traffickers, or people who take drugs, in other words, a segment of society that is not mainstream. And, it's okay somehow to confiscate everything they have so they can't defend themselves, for one thing, and put them in prison for a lifetime virtually. For what? Trying to feel happy? Really think about that.
No, the whole war on drugs. What is it called? Forfeiture? Forfeiture?
Yeah, that's right. Civil forfeiture. Mm-hmm.
Right. Okay. Well, they take everything before you're even convicted, and then sometimes even when you're found innocent, they don't give it back. It's really crazy stuff. Yeah, people in jail for God, sir.
I was going to say, I would like to plug the Institute for Justice for fighting that. It's ij.org. If your listeners are not familiar with them, they ought to be. And since I know we don't have much time, may I just say that I'm spending a lot of time these days with Liberty International, which used to be the International Society for Individual Liberty. Since our acronym was ISIL or ISO, we got hacked so much we had to change what we're doing. But we're putting out a lot of courses these days, one a year. I think we had 3 so far. We're going into 4 in a little bit. We're really excited about it. So you can go to the old website address, isil.org, or liberty-intl.org, and learn about this stuff. And I'm pushing it because I'm the chair of the organization, spending a lot of time there these days, less than the Libertarian Party, just because I'm an educator by I guess by inclination. So and it's important that we understand what liberty really is and how to take care of it, because if we don't, we'll all end up in 1984, maybe in 2024.
Yeah, no, there's all sorts of nasty things coming up in the next year. We could, you know what, Mary, Doctor, we're just going to have you back on, because there's so much more to talk about. You know what would be really cool is to have you and Spike Cohen on, and the 3 of us just kind of have like a campfire chat about like political philosophy, libertarianism versus, capitalism and so all this stuff, free market, and, whatever it may be. I mean, because I got all sorts of research under my belt as well. I think it'll be a fantastic conversation. Anyway, yeah, we're like actually 6 minutes over. That's how cool this conversation was. Folks, thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Dr. Mary J. Ruwart, thank you again so much. And it's always a pleasure talking to you. It's nice we can do a face-to-face. I like that. Yes. I prefer that. So keep up what you're doing. You're doing a lot of good for a lot of good people. We didn't even get to the whole thing that you did in the 80s to help AIDS patients. Do you want to do real quick, do that? Because I think people would be very impressed by that.
Well, I appreciate you having me on. I'd be happy to come back. I always do enjoy our conversations. So hopefully we'll see you soon.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into the Illinois Green Party. I'm your host, David Rych. Till next time, be good. Be great.
Say again?
I'm saying goodbye to everybody.
Okay.
Are you having a hard time hearing me?
Yeah, sometimes you're kind of fading out. I'm not sure why. I don't know if your listeners are hearing that too. But if they want to know more, they can go to my website, ruwart.com. It is back up, ruwart.com, and connect with me there too.
Sounds fabulous. Absolutely. All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Till next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.